The number one most effective protection that any of us have is our God-given built-in ability to sense when something is off. Christians would refer to this as discernment, and a non-Christian would just simply call it a gut feeling. Men and women who work in the highest levels of government, these are people who are experts in body language and interrogation, will all say without question that our own built-in sense of protection is the number one way that we can protect ourselves from predatory personalities. So now let's go to the other end of the spectrum. Now let's talk about the number one tool that manipulative and deceptive people use. You've probably heard the term gaslighting. So what is gaslighting? I'm sure you've heard it a lot these days. I do believe it's overused, but in this application, it fits. So gaslighting is a term that came about in the 1960s as a result of a movie called Gaslight. In the movie, this husband kept slowly going around the house and very gradually turning down the lights in their home, or the gas lights, because back then the lights were actually they were made out of gas. Anyway, so in other words, it was slowly, very slowly becoming dimmer and dimmer. So when the wife noticed that the lights were getting dimmer, she asked the husband if he was turning them down. And he answered her in a very believable way that he was not messing with the lights. And this caused such a level of cognitive dissonance that the wife ended up literally losing her mind. She went crazy. So prior to this movie, what we call gaslighting nowadays was simply referred to as psychological manipulation. It's basically manipulation targeted at getting the victim to question their reality. And here's how it might look in a church setting. So keep in mind, gaslighting is intended to keep us off balance. That's the goal. It's intended to keep you as a congregant from digging in too much, from knowing too much, from drawing too much attention to a problem. And so there's two main ways that you can tell if you're experiencing gaslighting. If you walk away from any interaction with a church leader, or anyone for that matter, but we're specifically talking church leadership. If you walk away from a conversation feeling guilty or confused, it is very likely that you've just experienced psychological manipulation, or in more modern terms, gaslighting. So what are some common gaslighting phrases? Let me give you a scenario. Let's say that there is a man at your church that just gives you bad vibes. He just gives you the creeps. And let's say that you were a victim of child sexual abuse as a kid. And as a parent, you want to make sure and protect your kids. So let's say there's a church event and this man comes up to you and says, "Hey, I'm going to go on and head over there. I can transport little Sally for you." And your gut tells you that you just don't feel comfortable. So you say to this man, "We don't allow strangers to transport our children until we get to know them better, or there is another adult present." And so this man responds to you, "Oh, okay, well, I'm sorry you don't trust me. I just thought I would help you out since it seemed you were really busy." Are you catching what's happening here? So in this case, many parents will cave because they'll feel bad. They're playing on your guilt. But here's what you need to understand. If this same scenario had played out with a mentally healthy person, and you had just simply stated, "Hey, we don't allow people that we don't know to transport our kids unless there's another adult present," a mentally healthy person will just simply respond, "Okay, no problem." They will not guilt you, okay? Here's another example. And this is what we actually experienced at a congregation that we used to attend. So there was a lot of problems, I'll say, with the preacher. And my husband and I spent months documenting behaviors before we even talked to this man. I want to say it was at least 8 or 9 months. So we talked amongst ourselves, just the two of us. Like, we would see him do something or hear him say something, and then the two of us would kind of talk about it and analyze it. But we logged behaviors for 8 or 9 months before we approached him to follow the Matthew 18 model of approaching a brother in sin. So I'm going to give you two examples that we personally experienced in this conversation with this preacher. So one of the things that we documented is that this preacher came up to us after service one day, and there was another woman in that congregation who struggled with some, I'll just call it mental issues. And she was talking to me one day, and then she walked away. Well, the preacher came over and he asked me if I was okay. And he made a very condescending, very contemptuous statement, about her. And he said to me, "Did she tell you about all of her problems?" And it hit me like, wow, and I remember I didn't say anything to him. I was kind of rendered speechless for a minute. But that's one of the behaviors that we brought up. And so when we brought that up to him and how we felt it was very inappropriate for him to be talking about this member to us, and keep in mind, we had only been at this church for maybe 2 or 3 months at this point. It was very early on. And so it just struck us as a very unkind thing to do and really kind of showed his character. So his response when we brought up that documented behavior was to look at us and say, "I didn't realize you guys were so sensitive about that." Do you see what's happening there? Like, he's minimizing what we actually saw. So another thing we confronted him on is he had also been on several occasions, not just with us, but we had actually documented him talking to different members of this congregation about his wife. And so we brought these up. We said, "Hey, you've talked about your wife in this manner," and we just named him off, XYZ. And he started crying. And, looking back, I remember after they left, my husband and I both felt very strongly that he was faking it, that he was just faking the tears. And so this is another example. At the end of that conversation, and we talked about way more than just the two instances I brought up. Like I said, we had been documenting behaviors for 8 to 9 months. We really wanted to move slowly. We have never in our whole lives prior to that instance ever been in a situation to confront a preacher on bad behavior. So this was very new to us. So obviously we wanted to move very slowly. But what stands out to me about that meeting, and it was 2 hours. It was a long meeting. After this preacher and his wife left, my husband and I struggled with feeling like, did we actually have legitimate cause to confront him? Were these behaviors as bad as we really thought? You see what's happening? We're questioning ourselves. We literally had waited 8 to 9 months, documented behaviors, dates, times, what was said, what we observed. We were very well prepared. And this is a story for another day, but this was an awful situation. It should have been dealt with years before we came. And so I just wanted to give you an example of how when we walked away from that conversation, we felt like the guilty ones. And so these are just examples of what you may come across. So to give you an example of something that we experienced when we were involved in what I have called the prosperity gospel. So years ago, there was a young woman that we went to church with who had a terminal health condition. And this young woman had many, many prophecies spoken over her. People would claim to have heard from God that she would be healed and whole. And these were very specific words. I mean, she had people telling her that God showed them that he was going to grow back her organs. that she was going to completely regain her health. And unfortunately, she ended up passing away. But when we left the prosperity gospel, there was several specific items that we confronted them on. A few of them were in regards to our own daughter. But we did bring up this young woman, and we pointed out the fact that, hey, we know that there was several prophecies made over her that she was going to be healed. And rather than just admitting that they got it wrong, they instead doubled down, and their response to us was, well, she's complete and whole in heaven now. And at that point, we knew that we weren't going to get anywhere. They had dug in their heels, and I've heard it described, like I've heard people that have left this movement describe it, that when you're trying to confront somebody that is either deceitful or they're self-deceived, it doesn't really matter, but trying to nail them down on the false teaching and the false prophecies is like trying to nail Jell-O to a wall. You just can't do it. And so I'm going to take a moment and read from the book of Jeremiah. This is chapter 23. I'm going to read the whole chapter. So I'm going to start in Jeremiah 23, starting in verse 9. This is specifically talking about false prophets. So it says, concerning the prophets, my heart is broken with me, and all my bones tremble. I have become like a drunkard, like a man overcome by wine. Because of the Lord, because of his holy words, for the land is full of adulterers. The land mourns because of the curse, and the grazing lands in the wilderness have dried up. Their way of life has become evil, and their power is not rightly used. Because both prophet and priest are ungodly, even in my house I have found their evil. Therefore, their way will seem like slippery paths in the gloom. They will be driven away and fall down there, for I will bring disaster on them, the year of their punishment. This is the Lord's declaration. Among the prophets of Samaria, I saw something disgusting. They prophesied by Baal and led my people Israel astray. Among the prophets of Jerusalem also, I saw a horrible thing. They commit adultery and they walk in lies. They strengthen the hands of evildoers, and none turns his back on evil. They are all like Sodom to me. Jerusalem's residents are like Gomorrah. Therefore, this is what the Lord of armies says concerning the prophets. I am about to feed them wormwood and give them poisoned water to drink. For from the prophets of Jerusalem, ungodliness has spread throughout the land. This is what the Lord of armies says. Do not listen to the words of the prophets who prophesy to you. They are deluding you. They speak visions from their own minds, not from the Lord's mouth. They keep on saying to those who despise me, the Lord has spoken. You will have peace. They have said to everyone who follows the stubbornness of his heart, no harm will come to you. For who has stood in the counsel of the Lord to see and hear his word? Who has paid attention to his word and obeyed? Look, a storm from the Lord. Wrath has gone out, a whirling storm. It will whirl around the heads of the wicked. The Lord's anger will not turn away until he has completely fulfilled the purposes of his heart. In time, you will come to understand it clearly. I did not send these prophets, yet they ran. I did not speak to them, yet they prophesied. If they had really stood in my counsel, they would have enabled my people to hear my words and would have turned from their evil ways and their evil deeds. And then, for some reason, my Bible version here is not letting me see verse 23. So I will go to verse 25. I have heard what the prophets who prophesy a lie in my name have said. I had a dream. I had a dream. How long will this continue in the minds of the prophets prophesying lies, prophets of the deceit of their own minds? Through their dreams that they tell one another, They plan to cause my people to forget my name as their ancestors forget my name through Baal worship. The prophet who only has a dream should recount the dream, but the one who has my word should speak my word truthfully. I have had several conversations recently with people who have come out of false teaching, such as we have. And one of the things I have talked about is that the number one hardest thing that we have dealt with is not the false teaching itself, because, we're in the process of rebuilding our foundation and going back through what we have been taught and passing it by the test of Scripture. Yes, it's been hard, but it's not been the hardest part. The hardest part has been dealing with the people around us that are still caught up in the lies. I think there's a tendency, especially when you've spent so many years in a community, you want to keep your friends, right? You want to maintain those relationships because, trust me, when you are in a position where you're starting over, it is gut-wrenching. You're talking about spending 20 plus years in a specific type of church community. And there was, when we kind of took off the prosperity gospel, I'll call them lenses, and we seen it for what it was, there was an instant being repulsed by that. And so even having conversations with people who are still in the prosperity gospel, it's difficult. We have tried and tried and tried, and it's gotten to the point where we have unfortunately had to allow most of those friendships to go. And so what I'm trying to, to kind of take it back to or to clarify rather, what the most difficult thing has been about coming out from under false teaching is it's dealing with the manipulation, dealing with realizing that for so many years, your mind was messed with. And again, I can see it so clearly now, and my heart grieves for people. Like I can tell when somebody is caught up in deceit or caught up in manipulation, but sometimes trying to convince somebody they're being deceived it's really challenging. So I'm going to wrap this up by just saying that if you start to see signs of manipulation from church leadership, I'm not saying like once, every one of us is guilty of lying or manipulating or gaslighting or whatever you want to call it. All of us are guilty of that type of behavior, whether intentional or unintentional, from at some point in our lives. But hear me on this. When you start to see a pattern of manipulation from church leadership, if you're repeatedly walking away from interactions, being made to feel guilty, or just having a general sense of confusion, that's a red flag. And you're going to have to make some decisions on either that church, especially if we're talking leadership, or otherwise. So I hope this has helped, and we're going to keep this series going.